Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. So I have tried in my last wrap up to make my wrap ups quite small because I asked you guys recently how you like them, and I think this will be slightly longer than I have promised they would be because I have been feeling a little bit under the weather recently, so I haven't been motivated to film. And I have taken quite a few books out of the library. I am trying to race through my NetGalley approved reads, and so I'm trying to get through books at a quick pace. I also have this week off and a little bit of next week, so I'm planning to binge books. So hopefully I will have quite a lot of other books to discuss, so I need to get these out of the way. So this is my wrap up of some of the books that I've read in September and then over into October. So when we last spoke, I was reading This Mornable Body by Tsitsi Dangarembga, which I have now finished, and I have a very conflicted reaction to this book. So I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars, and the reason I did this is because I really loved the writing. I think the writing was beautiful and she writes in a really interesting way. I also think the development of characters was really interesting, but fundamentally for me, this book had no plot. That is really difficult for me to enjoy a book that doesn't have a plot. The character just drifted between family members, and the character, the main protagonist, lost her job and she kind of drifted to her auntie's house, and then she had a mental breakdown and she drifted to another family member's house. And so it dealt with a lot of really interesting topics about Zimbabwean politics and culture there, and about women's place in Zimbabwe, and about mental health. And obviously, like I mentioned in my last video, the author was on Channel 4 News quite recently doing an interview about the politics in Zimbabwe, so it's very relevant to the author and she feels very strongly about it. And maybe it was a choice that the book kind of felt like it didn't have a point, and like people maybe in Zimbabwe at the moment are feeling like that. Maybe it was meant to be symbolic of the current cultural climate there. But in terms of reading, it became quite dull quite quickly, and it was a fairly long book, so that was disappointing overall. There's so much merit in it though that it was very conflicting for me to get to where I did with rating it. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because the way she writes is beautiful. And I do also think another great point is that you don't really have to read the first 2 books to get a lot out of this book. Considering it's third in a series, it didn't feel like that, and I don't know whether that's a positive or a negative. It didn't really feel like a standalone either. It kind of felt a bit debut-y to me, like there was a lot going on that had promise, but it hadn't really been dealt with in a way that was readable yet. There were so many interesting ideas and there's so many parts of the book that you could underline that were just beautiful, but I struggled to find an overall point, and it wasn't very memorable. I can't remember the main character's name now, which is a bit of a disappointment, but there we go. That's how I felt with that one, so I'm not going to linger too much on that because they're really the fundamental thoughts that I had about the book. So I do apologise if I sound a bit horsey. I've just got a really bad sore throat, very mucusy, so don't worry, it's not COVID, it's very mucusy at the moment, but it is making talking for a long time difficult, so bear with me. So then I finished Louis Theroux's Gotta Get Through This, which is his memoir autobiography. It's kind of more a memoir of his experiences in television, and I listened to this on audiobook from the library, and I really enjoyed it. I think if you're a Louis Theroux fan and you know about his documentaries and you're interested in him, I'm particularly interested in Louis. I think if I had a gun to my head and someone asked me what your celebrity crush was, he would be the nearest thing that I would pick. I do like geek chic and a good nerd, so I do have a soft spot for Louis, so I was quite happy to read his audiobook, and I think it's very interesting him being able to reflect. He also narrates the audiobook, so it's interesting to hear his thoughts on some of the documentaries he's done, and particularly a lot of the book was taken up with Jimmy Savile. and Louis's relationship with doing the documentary when Louis met Jimmy, and then creating a kind of professional relationship with him, and then his death, and then finding out everything that we did about Jimmy Savile and how he felt about that, knowing that he had developed a relationship with him, filmed with him, and kind of been unaware the whole time of the insidious nature of Jimmy, but also how he reflects that there were certain instances when he met Jimmy that there was something odd about him, but he didn't know how odd or how dark. So it is a very lengthy audiobook, but if you like Louis, it's quite quick to get through. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars because there is a new series on BBC iPlayer that we recently watched that was called Life on the Edge, and it's a 4-parter, and really the audiobook and that 4-parter have a lot of overlap with how he reflects on his very famous and infamous documentaries about people that are hated and people who are ridiculed and these extreme views. So when he did his documentary on porn and aliens and cults and Scientology, so he reflects all of that in the audiobook, and he does in this new BBC. So depending on how you like to consume, a lot of people might just watch this 4-part BBC programme and skip the audiobook, but I think a big difference between the two was the reflection on Jimmy Savile that Louis spends quite a lot of this audiobook dipping in and out of. He also, interestingly, does sporadically give us bits of his own relationship to his wife and his kids, and how he reflected upon all of these things and how his relationship evolved as he became more famous for his documentaries. And it was quite interesting hearing those segments on Nancy, his wife, because they had this raw, honest element to them that I think we have a perception of Louis based on his documentaries. He's kind of become a caricature of himself. But to finally get some personal information about him, considering he's quite elusive on the personal front, was refreshing. And to hear it from his own words was interesting. So yeah, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and if you're a big Louis Theroux fan, I would highly recommend the audiobook in which he narrates it, because it's just a little bit extra, like a cherry on top of the cake for your overall Louis experience. So I also read the very first Tony Parsons DCI Wolf book, which is The Murder Bag, which I told you previously I was starting. So this one is set in contemporary times, but it goes back to an incident 20 or 30 years ago, I can't remember roughly, where a group of lads who were part of a private school, they had a gang, and an incident happened which resulted in the death of a young woman, which we know as the reader in the very first chapter. And then as 20, 30 years later, as we start the novel, 2 of them are found dead at the beginning out of this big group. So Wolf quickly realises that it seems to be like someone's got a hit list of these boys. So something happened at this school that he has to figure out why this results in them dying. So obviously, as we know, they've killed a woman at the beginning. So DCI Wolf needs to figure this out, and then figures out who is getting revenge for her death. So it was really enjoyable. I actually enjoyed it a little bit more than Die Last, because I think I like a good murder plot, whereas I know Die Last was a murder plot, but it was a different subgenre about human trafficking, and about it did have a bit of a gang overlap, whereas this was definitely more of a murder mystery. And I love the idea of going back in time, an incident that happened a while back, and trying to piece that together. It's a bit more like an Agatha Christie for me, that mystery of going back in the past. And another book that I'll mention in a minute had that going back and finding out what happened 20, 30 years ago. I love that in books, going back to an event that happened in the past and how it's projected onto the future, and how we have to go back to find out the pieces. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed meeting the characters again, but from the beginning, knowing how Wolf gets into the murder investigation team in the police, and learning about the Black Museum again, which is in Scotland Yard, which is it's meant to be a training tool for the police, and it's kind of a museum of all the artifacts, weapons that police have taken off murderers and killers, and about famous cases that the police have helped solve. And it's just trying to show the reality that when you belong to the police, these are the risks. But Parsons uses it heavily in most of the books. He visits the museum and the man at the museum to try and find weapons that he thinks that the killer in that particular book has or is using. It's hard to say it's cozy because it's dark, but it's a bit like Cormoran Strike for me. It is cozy, it's familiar, I'm really enjoying it. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. It was just really fun and enjoyable, and I didn't in some ways see the killer coming this time. The way he writes plots is so intricate that even after a few weeks I forget how it ended, so I think that's quite good. It lends very well into being able to reread, and the plots are very well mapped out. So yeah, there's that one. Then I also read from NetGalley. I was approved by Random House UK Cornerstone, a NetGalley ebook of Killing for Company by Brian Masters. This was originally written in the 80s, and Brian visited Dennis Nielsen in prison and was able to compile a comprehensive look at Dennis Nielsen's crime and try and tentatively profile him, and used philosophy, religion and psychology to try and understand why Nielsen did what he did and what kind of killer he is, and to add to the archive. So I think this is fundamentally a very important text for criminologists, for people that are going to study criminal psychology, and anybody who's interested in serial killers. This is an important text. I definitely didn't think it was dated, which was very interesting because psychology keeps coming on at such a fast rate. But I think he really took the time to do his research to make this the most comprehensive and detailed he could. It didn't feel voyeuristic, which I was very impressed with, and it didn't feel like he was sucked into the world of Nielsen's fantasies. He wrote as truthfully and as objectively as possible and gave us a lot of information that as a reader then you could decipher from his early life, from his relationship with his mum, then moving to London, his relationship to his work, his relationships outside of work and romantic relationships, to create this really big picture of who Nielsen was, and then the crimes and the MO for the crimes. And one important thing that Brian argues continuously throughout this book was that he doesn't believe there was a devious sexual motive to the murders. The necrophilia element that is always a question posed around Nielsen. Brian Masters says it's not necrophilia as we know it, and there wasn't this sexual element. Some murderers will kill because they want to mutilate the dead body, but for Nielsen it was the playing of God and the moment when he could choose between life and death. It seemed to interest him the most, and he was killing for company, which is obviously the name of the book, but Brian goes into a lot of detail about how that differs from other criminals and how he had this loneliness that meant that killing them would allow them to listen to him finally instead of just walking away, and how he had a lot of rejection issues. So it's very hard hitting. I would certainly, if you have triggers for extreme violence or graphic descriptions, because this book surprised me because Brian doesn't shy away, and some of the descriptions that Nielsen talks about himself about the drains and getting rid of bodies. If you're particularly squeamish, just completely avoid this book, because there were some bits that I read that I found very disturbing. But overall, it's a very interesting text, and I think it provides a lot for the field of criminology and psychology that's fundamentally very useful. And overall, I was happy with this, and I think it will be a useful text to go back to. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars because it was written very well as well, and I didn't have any of the hang-ups that I anticipated I would going into it, like it being dated or like it being too simplistic. I think he really, really tried his hardest to make it as academic and accessible and as detailed and articulate as he could, so I was very impressed with that one. And another book that I got approved from NetGalley from Hodder and Stoughton was Graham Norton's new book Homestretch. Now this was wonderful. I was so impressed with this book. So I've slowly become a Graham Norton fan over the years. I read A Keeper by Graham Norton, and also surprisingly for a lot of people, I don't watch a lot of his TV programming. I don't watch the Graham Norton show, but he became a judge on RuPaul's Drag Race UK, and I really warmed to him through his appearance in that, because in Graham Norton's show itself, I think there's a caricature campness, and what's hiding there a little bit that I think doesn't allow me to feel as connected to him when he's in that show is, I think there is somebody who's incredibly intelligent, who's funny, who's interesting without being camp. And I think the camp is kind of a protective layer of clothing that he's used in the industry. For example, Alan Carr, who also was a judge on RuPaul's Drag Race UK. I'm a massive RuPaul Drag Race fan, entirely obsessed, it's a thing. But Alan Carr, obviously, he always puts on the 100% shiny light bulb, almost the campest level of radar of camp that you can get on TV, and I'm presuming he's not like that in real life. And I think over the past 20 or 30 years in television, LGBT has equalled camp, or it's equalled butch, and that are the roles that people have been assigned in television. And what I love about these books, it's meeting somebody that you think you know in a completely different way, seeing how beautiful these stories are, how well written, how interesting, how much drama and intrigue and emotions going on, really has endeared me to him. He is a fantastic author, and I am always hesitant to say that about celebrities or people who are famous on television, because just because you're good in the industry doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a good author. And I think a lot of people get people to ghostwrite for them and other things, and I have a whole feeling on that. But I can tell you that Graham Norton is a very talented author, and I will be reading anything that he writes. I want to go back and read his very first novel, but I read A Keeper and really enjoyed it, and then Homestretch was just the next level for me. Really loved it. So I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So this book follows an event in a town just outside of Cork in the 80s where there is a car accident, and in the car accident some passengers live and some passengers die. And then we go to the future where Connor, one of the survivors of the car accident, takes the rap and flees his town. And then we go through the repercussions of this, and in the present day, how it's affected the people of the town, how it's affected Connor himself, how it's affected the survivors of the accident, and how he comes back to his sense of home in his adult life. It reads like a murder mystery. You want to know who the perpetrator was. We question whether it was Connor. Connor's also been battling his sexual identity when he flees, and we learn all about that, and it's just exquisite. I loved it. Both of the different timelines, all of the characters were really well written. I love the LGBT identity crisis that goes on, and the relationships that happen, and the development of his sexuality. I've realised recently a lot of books that I've read have had a narrative particularly of gay men finding their identity, and it really is a theme that I love, and a lot of books I've read recently I've highly enjoyed because of that. This had a lot of parallels in some ways to Our Little Cruelties, because Connor is very like Luke, and although Luke wasn't gay, their storylines feel very similar, so that was quite interesting to find a parallel in a recent book I'd read. But my heart broke for Connor, and it's just written with so much emotion that I just got so invested in it from the beginning, and I read it so quickly and just loved it. Just 5 out of 5 stars. Absolutely loved it. And I would highly recommend you go and read Graham Norton books. They always kind of have a bit of a mystery element. They can be quite dark. They are set in contemporary Ireland, which I love. His roots, his identity, his experiences, you can feel that inflection because he's a proud gay Irishman. And these are people he knows. He writes the characters so well. It's just fantastic. So yeah, go and read Homestretch. It's amazing. And then I also read another Tony Parsons book, the second in the series, which is called The Slaughterman. So this one was about, in New Year's Eve, a family is butchered. The house, they find all of the family members bar one young little boy, and then Wolf goes on this trail to find out, because it's a nice private gated community and area, so he's thinking, why has this happened? And then they try and find parallels, because they find out that the family were butchered using a sterilizing gun that you use on farms for cows, and that's a very rare weapon. So he goes to the Black Museum, to Scotland Yard, to look for relevant weapons, and finds a few fleeting cases, and that takes him on his journey to finding it. Really like the formula now for these books, really enjoying them. This one was as good as Murder Bag for me. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's just really interesting. Good series, because you kind of get invested in some people in Wolf's life that come and go. But I love his relationship to Scout, his little girl, and Stan, his Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. And the story is just always really compelling. I don't know where it's going to go every time. I just trust Tony Parsons to give me what I want, which he seems to be doing. Very happy, and it's also making me excited because I found a new series of books that I like, and if I like this, hopefully it'll help me springboard myself onto meeting new crime authors. I have a tab on my phone and I just keep adding crime authors because at the moment I'm really in the mood, and I always want to be starting a series of crime thrillers. So if you have any recommendations of ones that I should really start, if you've ever read Tony Parsons and say, well, if you like him you'll like this, then please leave me a comment, because I always love recommendations. So I'm going to move on with this because I also managed to read Dead Time by Tony Parsons and Fresh Blood by Tony Parsons, which are 2 novellas, which I've read them out of order, so it should have gone Murder Bag, Dead Time, The Slaughterman and Fresh Blood, but it didn't do that. I read 1 and 2 and then the 2 novellas back to back. So I won't say too much about these. I gave them both 3/3.5 stars because they were just as good as the books, but they're just a novella, so you don't really get as much of the suspense, because you've got a suspect and then we have the confrontation and then the end, because they were only about 100 pages, so you don't have enough time really to draw out the suspense. So that's why I didn't give them as high as the main books. But really interesting premises. One was about a death that happens right in the slaughterhouse next door to where Wolf lives with his daughter, and he finds that they're trying to feed the body into the meat machine, and then he goes on a quest to find out what's going on with that. And in the novellas he has this kind of nemesis, which is DC Flashman, who works for the New Scotland Yard, who takes over the 2 cases because it's outside of Wolf's jurisdiction. But Wolf doesn't like being told that he can't investigate it, so he does on both occasions anyway, and obviously finds the killer that Flashman was never going to find. And then the second novella, he finds a body when he's walking on the heath with his daughter and the dog, and he has this horrible crooked smile that apparently many moons ago the gangsters used to kill people and give them that smile to know it was them. So it kind of takes him into the gang underworld of the Cray twins and some other infamous gangs. It's all a bit tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, Tony Parsons is very interested in crime, and you can see it in the books. He references the Cray twins a lot. He references in the Black Museum Nielsen's pots that he obviously put his victims' heads in. He mentions the Ripper and things like that. He obviously is a crime fanatic and is interested in that, and there's a lot of inflections in this book which I actually find quite fun. I know for a lot of people they would think why is he loosely trying to throw bits of true crime in, but I actually find it a little bit fun, and it's just a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's not really making any big statements, but he likes referencing the crime underworld of London in his novels. So yeah, that one was quite good as well. That had a bit of the crimey underworld and gangsterish subplot. So there then. And then I also just finished yesterday Sukibane by Douglas Stewart. And I was given a review copy of this by NetGalley as well, so I just want to thank NetGalley and all the authors of the books that I've mentioned that were NetGalley approved for allowing me to read and review them. And this was from Grove Atlantic, and this book blew me away. Now, I've managed to read a few books on the Booker, we'll call it long list, because while this Mornable body is on the short list, I did read Who They Was, and that ended up being on the long list. From all the scant long list reading I've done, this book is leagues above the other two that I've read. Now, I might end up reading the shortlist and find another book that's very impressive, but based on a hunch, I feel like maybe this will really be the best thing out of the list because of this immediate reaction I had, and this is the book that I want to win the Booker this year. It is so heartbreaking, and Shuggy as a character is just the most beautiful boy, and you feel such a deep connection to Shuggy, and you just want to give him a hug the whole way through this book. It really ripped my heart out, this book, and it's so cleverly done, because I've read many books that have very distressing subject matters and kids or characters that have harder lives in some ways than Shuggy, but the way he writes this really intimate relationship between Shuggy and his mother Agnes, it's so intimate, and you, as a reader, you're allowed so much access to their relationship that the heartbreak is just all the more poignant and upsetting and distressing as a reader. So this follows Shuggy, who lives in Glasgow in poverty and in squalor, and he lives with his sister and brother and his mother Agnes. And his mother Agnes has a terrible drinking problem, a horrendous drinking problem. And his father Shug ends up leaving them for another woman, and she just goes on a path of destruction with drink, and Shuggy ends up being the only one left behind. His brother and sister end up moving on, they can't cope with Agnes's drinking, and Shuggy is left with his mother, and every single time that she drinks and she falls off the wagon is just heartbreaking. Shuggy adores his mother, and that relationship is just heartbreaking and written so beautifully. And the way that Douglas Stewart writes about Glasgow is only the way someone can write about it who's grown up in that place. The way he writes about a young boy's experience in that squalor and poverty, of trying to have enough ready-made custard to eat, or getting the government money at the line-up for his mum and then going into the shop and buying booze for her. The scenes of when she's drunk and she's screaming in the street, and Shuggy waking up and leaving coffee and water by the side of the bed, and then her promising him a new life when they move, and he believes her, and it's just so sad, and it's really going to stay with me. I have this really visceral image of a very small, effeminate, loving young boy who's just completely heartbroken by the way his life is going. And this is really interesting because this book deals with Shuggy's relationship with his sexuality. We as a reader know quite early on that he's gay. He seems to know quite early on that he's gay, but he's living in a very homophobic area in Glasgow in a period of time that's very homophobic, and he's bullied a lot for it. And Oh, that was heartbreaking, just heartbreaking. I don't even think I can articulate any further with this book because it really blew me away. I didn't expect to feel so many emotions reading it. This really is spot on for zooming into that Glaswegian culture and being brought up in poverty in Glasgow, and the writing and the way that it emotes such emotion from the reader is just second to none. I just love this book. I really, really hope it wins the Booker. I would be so happy for it to win the Booker. So that's enough just rambling and gush. Let's see what I'm going to be reading next. So, oh my god, I've got so much to read. So I am reading Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid at the moment from the library. I am also reading The Death of Vivek OJ by Akwe Emezi. I also have The Searcher by Tana French. So The Death of Vivek OJ and The Searcher are both on NetGalley that are approved. So I'm going to be reading them and reviewing them very soon. And I also have, let me just get my app because I downloaded a lot because I'm off this week. So I wanted to get to some highly anticipated for a while reads that the library have in. So The Shadow King by Marza Mengesti, Unicorn by Amru Al-Kadi, Expectation by Anna Hope, and Bone China by Laura Purcell. And I've also just received on my loans The Hanging Club by Tony Parsons, which is book number 3. So I've got all them to be reading, and I also have Possession by A.S. Byatt, but I don't think I'm going to be able to read it in time for the discussion. But what I'm going to do is allow them to discuss and read it on Voxer and see what they think, and then just try and maybe read it in November. Our November pick for the BarterHordes Bookclub is going to be Paradise by Toni Morrison. I haven't read any Toni Morrison. I've ordered that book from World of Books, so that should be coming. So I'll hopefully just read those two in November. But that's what I'm reading at the moment, so sorry that this is very, very waffly, but I just wanted to get all my thoughts out because, as you can tell, I have a lot of books that I then have to read, and I don't want to be going through all of these when I got all of them to review for you guys. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.